So this is going to be a talk about the subject of Bach flower remedies. Now generally when people talk about Bach flower remedies, what they're really focusing on is the remedy, because for most of us it's this little brown bottle and how to use it and what we expect it's going to do for us that's the subject of both our teaching but also our learning, what we want to work with. But I think within this phrase, which is so famous now, there are three elements. There's the remedies, yes, and we'll come on to those later. There's the flowers, and they usually get forgotten, and they're very important to me. But there's also Bach, Dr. Bach, the man who discovered them. Now, what's often said about Bach is that he was a very sensitive man and he could feel things that other people didn't quite understand or recognize, and from this, by some sort of mystical osmosis, he discovered these new remedies. But I think if we go back and look carefully at his life, we can discover a completely logical chain, links of development in his thinking, which lead overwhelmingly towards the discovery of the new remedies, but also a new view of science that he set going in the 1930s, and which perhaps now, long time later, 80 years later, we're beginning to see how it might work. Now, he was, in spite of his name, Bach, Bach, whatever it is, he was neither German nor Welsh. It's thought that he was originally Bach, but during the First World War, when he was working as a medical doctor in hospitals in London, to have a German-sounding name would not have been very popular. So that's possibly how it came to be that he's often called Bach. But I prefer Bach. But it's not the important thing how you pronounce it, but what you understand about his approach to medicine and his thinking. Now clearly, for any of us, we begin our understanding of a subject by studying it and being taught by our elders and our professors. And Bach went through the conventional medical training and qualified, I think, about 1912, 1913. He did a sort of succession of postgraduate courses. And if you could imagine what would be in your thinking as a young, obviously a very bright student, graduate, and where would you put your energies? Where would you intend your life career to sort of move forward? Well, you'd look at what was the burgeoning, exciting things that were being done in medicine at the time, and you'd want to work with that. And without a doubt, Bach had professors or teachers who led him into the research field of immunology. Now, immunology is a huge subject, and I'm not going to pretend to sort of tell you how it works or what it is, but it's the basis of all modern medicine, as I understand it. The story begins with Jenner in 1796, when he discovers that somebody who has contact with cows and becomes infected with cowpox also has an immunity against smallpox. So he did really a very, very revolutionary stage of development, which was to make a vaccine which you could inoculate somebody with or vaccinate them. The word vaccine comes from vaccinia, which is the name for cowpox, or part of the name for cowpox. And when somebody is treated with this attenuated version of cowpox, they no longer get smallpox, because the immune system has learned to read the message of the infective process, which otherwise would give rise to illness. Now, this is the beginnings of the vaccines, development of vaccination, the development of a whole process of immunology. A a century later, you have a series of vaccines being developed for the great sort of problem illnesses of the time. And I mean, most of us have heard of a petri dish, and it's worth just illustrating this process, because there was a young researcher called Petri who worked with Koch, and what you do with a petri dish is to create a sterile sort of medium, which is agar-agar, and into that you drag a needle which carries the solution of the bacteria that cause an infection, and you culture this and grow it. This process of culturing a material is how you research what will kill that or what will act upon it in a way that kind of, and we're still basically doing the same thing with pathology and tests today. Going back to Bach as a young doctor, what would be more likely than that he'd begin the process of research, and this is indeed what happened with him. He was working as a doctor during the Second World War, 1914, 1918. He was doing the sort of, let's say, the blood and guts of medicine. He was helping sick soldiers coming back from the First World War, from the trenches. But also he began research, his own research work. And what he began to research was the intestinal flora of the gastrointestinal tract. What does that mean? Inside of each of us there is a continuous, a continuous envelope. Inside of each of us there's a continuous envelope which is from the mouth through to the rectum, more or less closing in different places as it goes through the stomach and from the small into the large intestines and so on. And that what actually happens inside there is a completely different world. There are millions and millions of bacteria and different, what are called flora, oddly enough, flowers, that act upon the process of digestion and the metabolism of any animal, any mammal. Why Bach started with this is a strange and curious question, except I'm sure he must have been given that as a project, because nobody thought that these had any particular significance. They knew that the populations of these bacterial flora rose and fell according to the varying types of person, but also the health of the individual. And what Bach's research began to show was that there was a link between the populations of these different bacteria and the type of flora which were present in the gut. Now, it's a bit of a stretch to kind of see, well, how is this going to be relevant to flower remedies and what I might think about my health and my psychological state? Well, it's a story, so let's take it a step at a time. The process by which he worked and discovered which type of bacteria were there was to use this petri dish, not one, but hundreds and hundreds of them, and to culture the bacteria on this agar solution. What you have to do is you draw some of the, it's called an emulsion, I think, but that doesn't really matter, but from the stools of the person. So an individual, you have to take a fecal swab. It's quite basic, this kind of stuff. And you put it in a flask, you mix it up, get a bit of water with it, but in the feces you will find traces of the bacteria that are part of the person. It's no use saying, I'm me and the bacteria are somebody else. No, the bacteria are part of us, that we are completely united. If we didn't have the bacteria, we're dead. We just couldn't do anything. So there's a huge world of discovery and, of course, invisible, all of it. So with this, he would take this fecal swab and culture the bacteria so that they grow after 2 or 3 days in a warm oven. These begin to grow, and of course you can't really say too much about them. You do it in 3 phases like this so that actually you get less and less of the original material, and the first one grows more densely, and then the third one, this is the one that you count. You then put it underneath a microscope, you identify which kind of bacteria is actually there so that you can classify it, and you see how many are there. So it's the presence of a particular bacteria and the numbers. And Bach began to classify these actually into 7 different types. I'll come to that in a moment. His thinking, the development of his ideas, as far as I can understand this, because we haven't got a great deal to go on in terms of information as to what was he thinking, what was he doing. I mean, his earliest essays date to 1920, so this is a period, 1914, 1918, you know, in the 5 or 6 years before that he's doing this research, and we're somewhat guessing. There is Laura Weekes's biography of Edward Bach, and she does give us, to be fair, quite useful information as to how this all happened, but to some extent we're still guessing. Now the theory of vaccination is quite simple. You take some of the material which causes the problem, whatever it might be, and you kill it so that it's no longer active. You then make a vaccine from it and you inject it into the person. If it was still active, it's going to cause you the disease. But because it's now a passive thing, in other words, it's no longer alive, as we would say, the information that's in the vaccine is recognized by the immune system, which then triggers an immune response such that you produce antibodies. So this is the antigen-antibody reaction, the invading problem and the immune response to safeguard the whole of the health of the system. If this is, in the case, let's go back to cowpox, if this is actually a vaccine from vaccinia, made from cowpox, when that's inside the human body, and then the real smallpox bacteria comes along, the body's already awake and alert and knows what to do to create an immune response. So it's educating the body. Make sense? Okay. If, in this case, Bach is working with his bowel flora, he thinks if we make from this sample a vaccine, just as you do in normal immune medicine, immunology, if you make a vaccine just as you do in conventional immunology and inject it back into the patient, what may happen? That's, in a strange way, it's, to us now, this is a kind of a weird sort of an experiment, because it's like, how would you like some of your disease and just push it back into you and see what happens? But this is apparently what was done, and the extraordinary thing is, he discovers that this triggers a health response in people who are chronically ill. Now, I'm not a medical doctor and my understanding of these things is fairly limited, but I do know that from this, Bach created 7 nosodes, right? 7 of them. A nosode is a medical treatment which is created from the product of a disease. So something that, let's say the pus that comes out of a boil, if you were to use that, unpleasant as it may appear, that would be a nosode if you used that as a treatment. So there's a kind of strange positive negative polarity in this whole process, that you're taking something that's a product of the disease in order to produce a kind of stimulus towards health. And these 7, they were called the Bach nosodes. Why Bach nosodes? Because he discovered them. What could be better? You're suddenly famous. you have remedies named after you. This is going somewhere. You now begin to have a career in medicine. And the very interesting thing about this is that Bach was beginning to treat people who had chronic disease. So his patient group were people who, I suppose essentially, contemporary medicine in 1915, 1918 had given up on them. Nothing else was considered possible. I mean, this is in the days before chemotherapy, it's in the days before radiation therapy and so on, for cancer. But people, 100 years ago, still had cancer, no question of it. It was a very present problem of health. So I suppose there's an element of experimentation in this, which Bach was able to do. And since he could show that it gave a stimulus to health, he's allowed to develop it and do more of it. And in fact, and of course in the days before the National Health Service, you could set up in private practice and do whatever needed to be done. And he set up a laboratory and had people working for him whose job was to take these fecal swabs from various people, from patients, and to prepare this nosode in the form of a vaccine which could be injected back into the patient. I think it's worth going back a couple of stages, so probably we need to kind of reorder this in the sequence. But let's go back for a moment, or just for a moment, let's think, what is the gastrointestinal tract? Really, all of us are no more than a hollow tube. This here is the mouth, so let's give this person a bit of a face. That's the top end. This is the mouth, and this is the bottom end. I mean, just so that we know they've got shoes. That's what we are. We take food in here, we digest it in the stomach, we absorb it, and we excrete. Okay, there are sphincters which keep the ends of the process closed, but so somewhere in here you get all these bacteria which Bach was studying, and of course some of them slip out at the end. This is how we get the sample from the fecal swab in order to see what the problem is and what the population and what's going on in here. So Bach's idea is, if you can take a sample of this, remember the Petri dish, and make up the vaccine, that then you can inject it into the person, bypassing the membranes of the stomach, straight into the person, straight into the interior of the whole metabolism, the whole human process. That's not very well put. You can inject it straight inside the body, which is where the lymph and the blood are circulating. And what he finds is, if you inject it like that, this population of bacteria begins to change. So by doing this, you can judge that it's had an effect. But it's very, very important that you think empirically about this, because it's no use having a theory that something will change if you can't show that it's changed. You've got to be able to demonstrate it. And as things developed, Bach was doing more and more of this work and developing theories and ideas about the intestines and how the intestines actually influence our health. Let me give you an example of what he begins to say when he's writing about this. This is a paper written, it is a bit later, 1924. He says, intestinal toxemia is no new subject. For the past 100 years, an enormous amount of work has been expended upon it, both medically and surgically, in an effort to counter its ill effects. And even back into the early days of our profession, we find treatment and drugs which had as their object the one and main object, the cleansing of the bowel. So, that's... This is the next paragraph. Again, the primary cause of the abnormality is essentially diet, and secondly, infection, which is able to take place only through incorrect food. Now, his thinking is this: what you take in to the gastrointestinal tract, water, food, and the potential for foreign germs, foreign bodies to come in. This is what causes ill health. So, we have another colour now. There's the bacterial flora, but also can come in here whatever it might be. If this is E. coli, if this is salmonella, it's easy to see what happens. We know we get a stomach upset, that's what we say. So we get ill. And Bach is studying this, the way that this works in relation to people who are chronically ill. Now you'd have to wonder why he does what he does. But there's a key thing in this whole experience which is absolutely essential to understanding Bach, which is to say that in 1917 he himself was diagnosed as having cancer. And so that immediately gave a focus to his research and his thinking and his interest in the whole process of health and disease, because now he's the subject of discovery. We don't know very much about how this happened, what caused it, or why he survived it, except to say that later he writes about this and he says, if you're happy and you're fulfilling your life's work, then you're likely to be in better health or in good health. So he begins to link actually the emotional state of the person with their potential for survival. And this becomes very important when we study Bach's developmental thinking and how he comes to look at other things. There's various other stages in his story which are particularly relevant and have a particularly strong impact on his thinking. And one of them is the day, the moment, the year when he meets Samuel Hahnemann and would have read his Organon, which is the absolutely sort of seminal work for homeopathy. What this actually did was to develop Bach's thinking by a quantum leap, because his concern was that with these nosotes that he's treating people, he's taking something which feels at least to be the product of the disease. You know, we don't really like feces. We view them as poisonous, and quite rightly. They're the debris we want to get rid of from the body. And the other thing is, when he prepares a vaccine, and he uses this syringe to puncture the natural sort of membrane, the protective membrane of the body, and put it inside the patient. And with homeopathy, in one leap, he discovers that he can actually take these Bach nosodes and prepare them in a completely different way, which is to say, to make a homeopathic treatment rather than a physical solution for injection. Well, this would be 1920, running through right through the 1920s, for the next 7 years. He's absolutely powering ahead with his discovery of these and working with these Bach nosodes. He develops an idea that instead of having an individual treatment made, you know, this is Julian, and this is Julian's petri dish made from his fecal treatment, and this is Julian's syringe treatment. We'll give it to Julian because it's unique and individual to him. And he starts to think, maybe we could actually make what he calls polyvalent vaccines, which would be, there's the word valency again, and which would be appropriate to a group of people. Because he's begun to classify these nosodes, or these bacteria types, according to 7 particular things. He gives them names. I can't remember them all. There's E. coli, there's dysentery, and another one's Proteus. Now these, I have to say, mean nothing to me as names, but these are the way that he classifies these bacteria, and this is how he begins to make these polyvalent vaccines. Now, we come to something very, very curious and interesting. At this time, in the 1920s, Bach has set up his surgery in Harley Street, which is where, of course, all the famous doctors have to have a place in Harley Street, so he has a place in Harley Street. And he begins to say that in the time, he's sitting here behind his desk, right? And in the time that it takes for his patient to walk across the room, Bach thinks that he can predict which of the nosodes will be appropriate for that person. So, knock comes at the door, Dr. Bach says, "Come in," and the patient walks into the room. Now, the way in which the person walks across the room, his whole manner, his presentation, his body, whether he's up, down, fat, thin, whatever it is, Bach begins to be able to view the picture of the body as being an indication for which of these will be appropriate. Well, I think this is something that he's gained from Hahnemann. Hahnemann describes this as a necessary part of taking the case history for a patient. That you have to study whether, which is perfectly normal now still in homeopathy, whether the patient likes cold or hot, heat, or what foods, how they sleep, whether they're more energetic at different times. And I think Bach has clocked this. He's recognized this as being the way in which to view an individual in order to relate them to a type. And in this case, it's the type of nosode that's going to be appropriate. I don't know if we can do this just in this situation, but let me show you a little bit of what it means. Because if I say to you, will you come and stand in front of the camera, the way that you stand, the way that you're sitting, is going to actually indicate, it's like the gesture of the person. Let me show you. I mean, some people sit like this, some people sit like this. The person coming into the room, when Bach has said there, come in. I mean, how do they come into the room? Do they walk straight in? Oh, good afternoon, Dr. Bach. I'm so glad you could see me. Or do they come in? Oh, Dr. Bach, I'm so pleased you could see me. Thank you for sparing me some time. I mean, it's a stupid caricature, but this is what people are like. Another person, he says, they knock on the door, come in, and the person's out there. Dr. Bach, what a beautiful painting you have on the wall outside your office. I know the person who was related to the second girlfriend that this man had when he was in Madagascar. I was in Madagascar, and it's a very interesting story. Where have you been? You come in for a doctor's appointment. I know, but this is so interesting up here. And these different ways of behaving were indicative of the whole of the person as it was expressing this classification of the 7 Bach notes. This becomes very, very important as Bach's ideas develop and as we come towards his discovery of the 38 Bach flower remedies.